I'm going to open up the floor to questions. The way that we'll do this, we have a roving mic in the room. I'll take 3 or 4 questions at a time. I'm actually going to start with one of the questions that's just been posted from somebody listening online, so that'll be the first one. Nico Tillon from Conciliation Resources has said, perception surveys demonstrate the importance of monitoring the impact of international high-level strategies and could perhaps empower people in contributing towards donor development strategies. What lessons have been learned by researchers in that regard? You know, how can the perceptions of local people really start to influence? And then second, what can be done to increase accountability and shifting donors' attention to the perception of direct beneficiaries, so that that will help them understand how strategies are or are not well adapted to specific contexts. So we'll start with that one. Have we got any hands? People who want to ask questions? Can you please introduce yourself and tell us where you work or who you work for when you ask your question? Thanks.
Okay, my name's Anthony Ellis. I work at Integrity Research and Consultancy. A couple of questions for the panellists. Thank you very much. The first one, Bob, you mentioned the importance of investment in fragile environments, but didn't, I think, get a chance to go into that in your presentation. In terms of perception surveys and investment, what would you see the connections being there, and is it an important part of encouraging investment into a post-conflict fragile environment? And then the second question is about research markets in conflict environments. I don't know what the exact figures are necessarily for, say, spending on research in Afghanistan over 10 years, but what does it mean for the conflict to introduce these sometimes quite sizable research markets?
Hi, Patrick Barron from University of Oxford. Thanks to all the presenters. They were great presentations. Another question for Rob. I'm interested if you could share a bit more about the methodology of how you generated homicide rates through using survey stuff. I've done quite a lot of work in Indonesia, and one of the things we've found is that either doing community level surveys or key informant surveys tends to get very distorted reports of levels of violence at the leader level, because they have incentives to underreport violence. At the community level, often because people actually just don't know or have problems with recall and time periods. And because of that, we've used other methods such as local newspapers or other sources. So I'd be interested in just learning a bit in Haiti or other examples how you've used survey methods to generate violence data.
Hi, Emily Spears-Mears from International Alert. I've got a 2-part question. The first part is, are perception surveys really new? And certainly, Tom, from your presentation, you mentioned starting to use them about 12 years ago. And then secondly, how different are perception surveys to other types of more academic research that don't necessarily find their way so quickly into sort of development and aid policy discussions? Is it just that we're talking about them here because the Asia Foundation is using them and you're an NGO, whereas we're not talking about Patrick Barron and the University of Oxford's perception surveys that they've been doing? Just, that's the end of my question.
Okay, thank you. Rob, there were a couple specifically directed to you, so shall we try and answer those first?
Sure. First, thanks. Great questions. And I'll just address the ones that are to me, and I'll let my colleagues address the one perhaps that came online. And if I have anything else, I'll pipe in. With respect to investment and you know, what's the influence? I suppose one of the tragedies in Haiti, one of the many challenges in Haiti, is that up until about end of 2009, there was this sense that there was somehow kind of a possibility happening. For the first time in many years, you saw some net actually positive GDP growth. You saw high-level groups of business people coming over and having discussions about different forms of manufacturing investment. You had the tourism industry suddenly, you know, poking its head around in a very crowded market for tourism, thinking about the possibilities for tourism off the North Coast. So you had, you know, this moment after many years of sort of static to decline of a possibility, and then the earthquake hits. And if ever there was a time that Haiti needed to have a good news set of stories, it was probably right about then, at a period of intense tragedy. And there are a lot of reasons why people would over-securitize the response. One way to unlock resources is to have a dramatic security threat, and this can rapidly, you know, condition politicians and others to to other resources. However, the net result was that there was a general cooling effect from investors and otherwise when they started to see sort of the high rates and high spikes in violence. Tourism possibilities just disappeared. They were off the radar. The level of confidence that the level of confidence in institutions, including the institutions that are ostensibly there to monopolize the use of force and or preserve property rights, were called into question. A whole range of other forms of risks in local and domestic investment suddenly emerged because of the kind of narrative that was hyper-securitized and suggestive of a high level of volatility. So I think that perception surveys, by asking a number of high-level, medium, and lower-level questions, not just around rates of violence, which I'll get to, but also around the quality of institutions, the nature of service provision, including the police and the justice services, and otherwise, I think was trying to resolve that net question of rebalancing information asymmetries that existed, and that resulted, I think, in as I said, a cooling effect. So I think there are a number of ways that surveys can provide certain forms of information that are of interest to a wider audience. And the key is to get those things out of the hands of the small numbers of researchers or donors or agencies that often are guarding their information, as George said, into the public domain. However, it does require, I think also as George mentioned, due ethical kind of considerations and a judgment call about the extent to which information like this can do harm. And there, as with all of our experiences, there were backlashes invariably, and we can talk about that maybe in a separate set of questions in terms of what kind of backlashes we experienced and how you address them. With respect to homicide, I mean, first point is yes, there are many ways of collecting data on I'm going to talk about fatal and non-fatal, or intentional violence that has fatal or non-fatal outcomes. The most common approach, which I think most people in the room probably are aware of, are sort of archival or media reviews. So event-based assessments where you sort of hoover up masses of media, you code the media, and then from that you extract the number of deaths in particular incidences, and then you establish some kind of estimate. And that's what most people, I think, most researchers conventionally have done in conflict-affected settings. And there are a number of large organizations that are involved in doing that on a regular and routine basis. And there are a lot of advantages and criticisms. Another approach which is often used is to go to the autopsies. You know, check out the wards and the hospitals and the funeral parlors and the religious individuals who often keep tabs of who's dying and who's not in their community. And you essentially do a collection of this. And a number of human rights organizations often use that kind of approach. And it's been used in Haiti. The University of Florida did that as well. A third approach, which is even more innovative, I found, was NGOs like Viva Rio, a Brazilian NGO, which brokers peace deals in particular sectors of Port-au-Prince between gangs. And they have essentially created a system whereby members of the community themselves report on questionable deaths in the community. And then there's a discussion they have where they triangulate. And the way they incentivize that discussion, which you think might otherwise not occur, is by having a lottery. And every month that there's no homicide in the community and it's cross-referenced, then there's an award, that a lottery, a prize that's awarded that everyone puts into, right? And you might say that would result in a disincentive to report, right? Or it might distort, but actually they have a triangulation mechanism. And what they discovered is a lot of bodies they find in the street that they might have thought may have been due to a homicide, might have been due to a killing, actually were not. It was somebody who got hit by a car, and so through a process of triangulation discussion in an area where there's a totally resource or data scarcity, they were able to generate some interesting numbers. Not totally exhaustive, but the essential point I'd make, and I'll talk about how we do it, is that it's a lot easier, I think, to report on homicide, a violent death, than it is to report on victimization. And we know the variation, especially when you get down to sexual victimization, sexual and gender-based violence, where it's extremely difficult. There's a whole reluctance. The first point I guess I'd make is the way we do kind of a verbal autopsy type approach. So what we go in is the first point I guess is to have a statistically large enough sample so you're able to capture exactly those areas where high violent areas where you might have bias, which I think is what you're talking about. So you oversample in areas where you think there's potentially a high level of violence, so to be able to account for the possibility of underreporting. The second point is that when it comes to death, like a homicide, that's something that's not really subjected to a big recall bias. People are often I don't know if you could do this in certain areas, like war-affected areas where there's perhaps a disincentive between combating parties to talk about it. But in a situation of generalized violence, organized violence like in Haiti, people will recall if someone died in their family. So you ask 3 questions. The first question is how many people are in your household. The second question is, has someone died in the last 12 months? And the third question is, if they died, and a very small proportion of the population will register a death in their family, then the question is, how do they die? Did they die? And then there's a whole drop-down series of questions that you have to ask about the nature of the death, and then you can establish, you know, the possible environmental factors associated with that. So that's how we approached it. And we got a statistically high enough sample to be able to say something meaningful about it, and then we report over time. And then, of course, what you do is you go back and you cross-reference it with whatever other forms of data sources suggest that are out there that might be, and you have to kind of render a judgment on the basis of that.
Do you want to follow up on anything, George?
Yeah, I thought I'd just speak to the matter, the question about how the findings may have been used by policy shapers or policy makers. I mean, the challenge we face in many of the countries that we all work in is simply aligning the interest of the donor with the interest of the government, and then with the interest of the public. And that itself is a struggle, setting aside survey findings. And so one way to use survey findings really is to spend some time disseminating and engaging these 3-4 different principal actors, the findings of the survey, so that they begin to understand what has made sense in terms of investment, or in terms of targeting, or in terms of resourcing. Some clear examples in Afghanistan, I spoke of this in November when I was here last, that, you know, over 6 years, if you track public perceptions in terms of government performance, or let's say donor performance, it's very clear that people calibrate their perceptions and measures of progress and performance to basic local needs. So it turns out they're clearly able to say things about education, health, and drinking water, whether that was good or bad, and generally good grades in Afghanistan for those. But then speaking about what about irrigation, electricity, and jobs, well, generally poor grades, and the donors go down over time, and you have a clear sense, and you're able to say something about it. Over the last 2-3 years, we've got a minister of education who's somewhat interested in knowing these numbers. He has every year asked, for example, you know, what does your survey say this year about education? And so you slowly begin to get people interested in having input into their policy. It's a very difficult thing, I would say. Even in very normal places, the use of public perception surveys to inform public policy only occurs during elections, and generally in terms of how popular a political party might be. But I would argue that there is great value. There is a shift now in terms of government use of this. So that's one. Second is, in terms of you know, this whole question about who do the people go to for certain kinds of services over and above conventional development sectoral interventions. So, for example, dispute resolution. Again, in places like Afghanistan and Nepal, where I am currently, there's always been a tradition of dispute resolution by certain people. Now, setting aside the question of power relations and sort of, you know, how does the dispute resolution affect their rights if you're a marginalized person, setting aside that, access to dispute resolution is a very big problem in most countries, usually resolved by development actors by providing formal justice interventions, you know, courthouses and this and that.
That's right.
But turns out in our surveys we see it as increasing turning back and turning into your own communities for dispute resolution. Well, if I were interested in providing access to justice, I would take a serious look at what informal justice arenas available, mechanisms available, and formal justice, and you would really target your interventions accordingly. It's easier for NGOs to do that than for other donors. But and it really provides you some programming ideas. We've done that in Islam-related work, in dispute resolution work, and more importantly in subnational governance in Afghanistan, where our surveys have showed like increased attention to subnational politics and to ulaswals and district governors and things like this.
Okay, thanks, George. Tom, do you want to respond
Sure.
to Emily's question?
Yeah, let me also respond to the person online, just about whether surveys help to shift focus towards individual citizen interests and perspectives. I think they definitely do, obviously, but one example of this often comes out and when we have surprising findings that are particularly surprising to the international community. One example of this, in 2003, we did a voter survey in Cambodia about 6 months before the parliamentary election there. Pretty much every time we do a survey of voters, we always ask, you know, do you think the country is heading in the right direction? It's a fairly standard question. And shockingly, in 2003, something like 82% of Cambodians thought that things were going very well. And this absolutely shocked the international community because there had been an increase in human rights violations, and governance had clearly been deteriorating, and you know the coup government had sort of been in place for 6 years at that point, and there was real shock from that. But the reality is, it really focused on the fact that as individuals in rural areas had the longest period of peace in their lifetimes. They had seen, small but very evident sources of new incomes and better infrastructure, etc. And so the things that mattered most to individuals were actually being addressed. And so that helped to shift the thinking, at least in Phnom Penh at that time, to some extent. So I think there are many other examples, I'm sure. Just on the question about, are surveys new? Well, of course they're not new, and having an NGO like TAF do them is also not particularly new. But what I would say that is new is there hasn't been a lot of surveys done in places affected by violent conflicts, right? And the role that we often play is basically in two areas. One, because we're there for a long period of time, most of our offices are many decades in the country, we often have the ability to access these areas much better than academics who may be based elsewhere, or organizations that are based elsewhere. Most of our staff are usually local, and we tend to have a knowledge of a conflict area that allows us to navigate very, very tricky and dangerous questions and issues that often would come up in a conflict area. So I think that is the value that an organization like us can play in that. But I think the bigger question, and I think the promising part, is that we're seeing greater and greater collaboration between international NGOs like us and academics on some of these questions. Academics realize that we have access, we have the ability to implement a survey often more easily. And importantly, I think that we're seeing more of an integration of the kind of data that you have come out of a survey with our work and with the thinking of the donors, et cetera. So some of the best programs that we've done have been basically start with a survey, reflect on some of the interesting findings, shape what we do, work with a donor to figure out how we fund it, and then we do programs that are very heavily customized to local conditions. And this is particularly true in conflict areas. So I think it is promising, but not particularly new.
Okay, thanks very much. We'll do another round of questions. I've got one more online from Jennifer Salahub from the North-South Institute, who says, many of the panelists mentioned the importance of working with local enumerators and researchers. How are you ensuring their safety beyond chaperones for women in Afghanistan? What sorts of training are you providing? And also a question about, how does that relate to Rob's tangent about the backlash that people might face, enumerators might face, if they're staying in the community? And then let's just open up the floor again. One over here, and then we'll go three along the row here. And I've got my eye on you two for the last round, okay?
Freddie Carver from DFID. I just wondered, obviously one of the things I think DFID's really struggling with is this question of attribution. And I think it's a real challenge for survey findings to get into the detail of the why. And I'd just be really interested in examples from any of the panel about where, and just the example also, I've seen some work recently about showing there are lots of examples where survey data on perceptions of security is really positive at exactly the same time that administrative data around actual levels of violence and level of insecurity heading in the other direction. And clearly that begs the question why, and understanding what are the policy levers that are actually going to have an impact in that situation. And I'd be really interested in some examples of where we've really been able to use, or you've really been able to use these findings to understand what are the levers that are going to have that kind of impact, and can we really understand why people are giving the answers they're giving and how that plays out in reality. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. The gentleman just in front of Malcolm.
Thank you very much. My name is Patrick Kianda, Middlesex University. I'm the president of the International Politics and Development Society. I just have a small comment. It's a question, a comment that was made that Haiti is one of the poorest countries and one of the largest recipients of aid. I think that's an irony because that's what's bothering me.
You're not alone.
Okay. And then the lady here in the second row.
Thank you. Anouk Richtering, Justice and Security Research Program, a sister program of yours. So my question is actually pretty much related to the first one. So to what extent can perceptions be used as a proxy for the actual situation? So perception surveys obviously sort of measure how people feel about the situation, but not what actually happens. So especially if you're talking about security, to what extent can you actually say, oh, how secure people feel actually says something about how secure an area is?
Okay, thanks. Can you send the mic to the back? We'll pick up those two people in the final round. Anybody want to start?
I can start.
Okay, thank you.
I just want to add one small point, which about this question about what's new, what's not, and just simply that, in addition to what you said, I would just simply add that I think there's also something interesting happening with respect to the methods and the tools we have today. We're able to do things that we couldn't do even 5-10 years ago, and that's these are really exciting developments in terms of, the whole geospatial dynamics. I mean, it used to be only experts who had, training in ArcView who could manage, I remember ArcView. I remember being trained in this thing, and it was a cumbersome, challenging creature. And now we're able to do kind of different kinds of georeferencing with Google Earth and other things we just didn't think was possible. The use of ICTs and SMS and smartphones. I mean, the 3G penetration right now in parts of Latin America where I live, exceeds 80%, and mostly among young people. And you can do really interesting, bounded crowdsourcing stuff, which I think still has yet to be tested in all sorts of ways. So I do think there's something new about the scale and the speed and the pace and even the nature of layering of information and data fusion that is really exciting. And I think we're only now in the beginning stages of learning what's possible. With respect to security, we had long discussions over the over the last 2 days about security, and simply to say that I think that obviously, for us there's a critical importance, and was alluded to by George, about ethical protocols being developed and security protocols, and having very for me, it's your enumerator team security is first, and your respondent is probably up there as well, and then you kind of go from there. And but there are invariably in this area real challenges and trade-offs that need to be reflected on, both for your enumerator teams but also your respondents. And these are, again, are questions. And the only point I'd make here is that I think we're very far behind in the academic community in thinking about the IRBs, the Ethical Review Board, and the kind of ethical processes by which we are able to validate our surveys before we actually go and do them. In fact, we're deeply ill-equipped in the social sciences to be able to manage this, and this is a big gap that I think needs to be reflected on. And I won't talk about the experiences, but I'm happy to pick up with the North-South Institute another time by email. The third point about attribution. This is a challenge. I think it was Freddie. You asked this. I mean, the first thing I'd say is that a lot of these surveys aren't designed to establish a particular form of attribution necessarily. So we're not doing beneficiary impact assessments. I mean, we could do those, and you require a certain level of data to be able to do them. But in a lot of the places where we work, I'm currently finishing one in Haiti right now, we don't have pre-data, any baseline data. We're in the process now of reconstructing post-data. You don't have beneficiary data, because most of the partners actually don't collect information on who they're in fact supporting. So in fact what you're doing is you're reconstructing a whole data set from scratch. And it's only after you do panels, repeat panels or some kind of control, or if you're more innovative, you might do experimental design type approaches, that you can start establishing the direct causation. What we look at more as association or correlation, which tells you and answers certain things. But here I would simply add the contextual qualitative approaches to start interrogating your data. And that's unfortunately an unsatisfactory answer. And I've been given the 2-minute sign. Only thing about Haiti, I won't even begin to answer that particular question, except to say that that's a question that many people have scratched their heads about for many years. And it's many changes about very rapidly changing priorities amongst donors who create all sorts of contradictions, unevenly distributed aid that's actually mandated but not actually allocated, a whole bunch of problems about that. So I would be very careful about looking at direct relationship between the overall funding basket and outcomes. Often a lot of that aid doesn't actually see the light of day, or it goes back into the pockets of people who are there who leave quickly. And I will leave. Sorry.
Thank you. George?
Just a couple of responses. One first on the safety of enumerators. One thing to remember is that we are not an organization that comes in, does the survey, and leaves the country. So with any of our work, we have to live with the consequences of our decisions. So in terms of risk management, I would argue that it's constantly in the front of our minds. It's a decision I, for example, as the head of an office, lives with every day. So we're a little familiar with that kind of risk management. Specifically with speaking about how we manage our surveys, one is that in most countries that we are in, we partner with local organizations or help local organizations become capable in doing surveys, which means that a lot of that risk in some ways gets transferred over to the local organization. Now, don't forget, we are not transferring and leaving the country, we are still there. So in many ways, we get pulled into a lot of the preparations that go in reducing the risk. So for example, in Afghanistan, one of the ways we've designed our surveys is to use enumerators from the locales in which we want to ask the questions. So you want to be sure that the supervisors and the enumerators are generally from that same location. They aren't perceived as alien or outsiders. That's a critical first order of constraint that you have to overcome. The second is that before going into an area, we've usually talked to the persons who are the most powerful actors in the area, whether it's government or non-government. We don't distinguish. We won't say we won't talk to somebody simply because So the idea is that they know beforehand that you're going in. In case they don't, there are elders in the locality who provide a way to mediate the relationship either before or after an incident. In the case 3 years ago, we had a couple of colleagues who were stopped and let's say held for several hours. Luckily, the data forms were with the female enumerators, and so they were allowed to leave, and the males were kept until clarification was obtained on what they were doing. And the elders, the village elders in that particular community simply negotiated and told them that this is all above board. They continued with the exercise. It wasn't really stopped. So that's one way to do it. Second, which is an additional, is they all carry letters that talk about the work. In every case, they have a letter from the government, but they may choose to use that or not, depending on who's stopping them. They also have a letter from the local person. If in the case of districts, it would be the district governor or some such documentation that basically says that they're researchers and that they're willing to share any information that they've found. So these are the ways in which we've tried to reduce the risk. Again, it's a fragile state. There's finally, speaking about the sort of the perception, this question on security, and it's related a little bit. It's not a question we care too much about in terms of like, well, who do you like the most, the ANP or the ANA and all that. People who give money for SSR, people who want to build capacity for the forces are really concerned about the perception of the forces. In our collaborative way of deploying the survey, we've agreed to ask those questions. In general, it's interesting to know if people think well or not. For us, we can't do much with the findings. And then the other question about, well, what do the findings really tell you anyway, right? When the security is going downhill, somehow everyone seems more and more confident in the police and the army. Our usual answer to this is that a nation and a people that have lived with violence and insecurity for 40 years have a very different perception of insecurity than you and I. And so for them, what is insecurity at the local level can be quite different than what we think of. And so you really have to think of that as one dimension to your answer. The second dimension to the answer is the aspirational aspect of it, where you've had multiple militias running rampant through the countryside. Now you have the hope of one particular militia that's legitimate in one uniform that is presumably accountable and answerable. And so it's an aspirational answer which says, look, we believe that this force will do well for us, And so this is the only answer we can give. In terms of the ANA getting more marks or the ANP, well, they're in barracks most of the time or out there engaging in, they're not visible every day to the population. The ANP is. The opportunities for rent seeking are higher for ANP than ANA in that sense. So some of the answers are colored by that kind of context. That's all I can say about the security answers.
Just very quickly, so we can pick up the last two questions.
Sure.
Is there anything you want to add?
Well, just very quickly to answer Freddie's question, I think, we're not arguing at all that this is going to be the attribution silver bullet. And I mean, obviously, there's some ways that surveys used in conjunction either with RCTs or with other instruments might be an effective way to try to isolate causality, but it's, that's not what we're going for usually. I mean, generally how these can inform programs, I mean, I would label two of them. One is they help to prioritize with a set of options of the types of things that you might do, and they help to test assumptions. And so, for example, some of the questions that we've asked have specifically gone to address local conditions that we think are important to draw out. In the Philippines, on one survey, we asked people whether they would prefer to have a competitive local election, or would they rather just have one candidate on the ballot so that they wouldn't have the election, the violence that goes with elections, which is so common in the southern Philippines. In most of the country, it was 16%. In the autonomous region of Muslim Mindanao, it was 52%. And so, that tells us a lot about the priorities of people in the autonomous region, about what we might do and maybe what we shouldn't push so hard on. It also tests some assumptions about people's priorities in those types of areas, and it helps to give some numeric and sort of some validity to a case or an observation that we've seen for a very long time. So generally, we think that these are most valuable when you use a cluster of data points to make a qualitative argument about change. Not that you're going to have data point A over 6 years is going to tell you absolutely that this program led to these outcomes. So.
Okay, thank you. I think we've got time for those last two questions. Can you keep your questions really brief, please?
Very brief, thank you. Actually, a bit of a follow-up on the question of local partnerships. Could you tell us a bit more about how you built that partnership in Afghanistan and what that meant? What were some of the processes involved and how eventually you got to the point of 600 enumerators and the level of quality that you demand now?
Can you just remind us who you are?
Sorry, Andrew Cleary from Integrity Research as well.
You.
Thanks.
And then a last question here.
Hi, I'm Lillian Fan from the Humanitarian Policy Group here at ODI. I actually had a question for you, Robert, about Haiti. I'm actually going to Haiti next month to participate in the production of the Office of the Special Envoy's final reports, the lessons learned on Haiti, which you probably know about. So I was actually, well, I would like to talk to you afterwards about this, but I would like to hear from you if to your knowledge, there's actually been any perception surveys on the other side, which is, are asking international actors about their perceptions of the Haitian government and the way that has in fact really influenced the kind of strategies for aid, and perceptions of fragility, perceptions of what the capacity levels are, the levels of integrity are within the Haitian government and different sectors of the Haitian government. So that's really my question. I had a very quick question for Tom as well, and that's really just just about what your engagement in Myanmar is, if any.
Okay, George first.
When we first started and decided to have a program on surveys, the first decision point was, in terms of capacity, was do we continue to bring in people from time to time from outside, or do we try to work with someone inside? And so we decided we'd go with, for cost reasons and for, let us say, capability building reasons, we thought that it would be good for us to invest locally. We made the argument with a donor and got the funds to do it. In terms of working with a local partner, it's really difficult to find research-focused local organizations unless they have already partnered with someone from outside who's already built into them some sense or some appreciation for research. In the early days, I'm trying not to be, how should I say, patronizing or whatever. But I mean, there has to be, you have to know that there has been an attention to humanitarian issues and conflict issues rather than saying, let's really invest in research. And once we made the argument to a donor that you have to invest in research, thankfully they did, we had a challenge of finding a partner who was willing to then spend 5-6 years with us and invest. So one is we did find that partner, a local partner. I don't know how much detail you want. I can give some after our conversation now. Second is the consideration that partner has to have a constant inputs related to capacity building, and we needed to pay for that as well. So in addition to contracting the partner, there was a facility there, an action line item that involved bringing in someone from outside to commit to engage with them in capacity building. So training on, let's say, software related to statistics, periodic participation in conferences, general sort of orientations that relate to statistics, and then participating in survey design and deployment. That was one early stage. Very soon we realized that it wasn't enough for this external group to just be helping. We needed to be on top of that as well. So that's when we went ahead and recruited our own person who was a full-time devoted to quality control, issues of problem solving between partners, international, national, etc. You've got to really invest in that. So you've got to have one more layer of staffing.
I'm sorry.
I haven't answered all the questions.
Okay. I think actually we're going to have to stop because we need to finish and we need to give Robert and Tom a chance to respond to the other two questions. Okay. But maybe you can...
Yeah, we can chat.
Try and grab Georgia at the end and have a longer chat with him about it. Apologies.
My answer is no. But I mean, I could simply say that there's been a long, long engagement in Haiti of a lot of different donors since the 50s and 60s. And today you've got over 40 bilateral donors, every conceivable NGO, multilateral under the sun. And to my knowledge, there's been no systematic survey done of donor perceptions. But it might be an interesting project. But I could talk to you afterwards about it.
Okay, thank you. And Mindanao.
Myanmar.
Oh,
Myanmar. We should just talk afterwards. It's
We're being urged.
Okay, that makes it much easier for me to close things down. Thanks very much to our presenters. We're going to stop on time because we've worked them really, really hard for the last 2 days in our workshop and they really need to have a rest or a beer or something. If you want to talk to them briefly at the end, please do, or share contact details with them so that you can get in touch with them at some other time because they might look a bit glazed right now. I'm not sure. Thanks very much for all your questions. There'll be a write-up, I think by next Monday, of the session online on the ODI website, and you'll be able to look at the presentations there and also look at a review of what's happened. But that's all, and thank you very much, everyone.
Right.